Today is July 25th, 2026. And right now, as you listen to this, a 33-kilometer strip of water is practically holding the entire world economy hostage.
Yeah, it really is.
Welcome to today's deep dive.
Yeah.
We are looking at the Strait of Hormuz. And, I mean, we have a massive stack of sources to get through today.
Huge stack.
We've got financial intelligence briefs, military timelines, verified maritime tracking data, and the latest economic models from Wall Street's biggest institutions. Like, we're talking Goldman Sachs, the IMF, World Bank, all of them.
Right, the heavy hitters.
Exactly. And our mission today is really to just cut through all the cable news noise because we're dealing with complex, very politically sensitive military actions between the U.S., Israel, Iran, and the Houthi forces.
Yeah, lots of moving parts.
But just to be clear right up front, we aren't taking any political sides here. We're impartially unpacking the military, economic, and historical realities to understand what this crisis means for the global economy and, frankly, for your own wallet.
Because it definitely will hit your wallet.
Oh, 100%. But honestly, the most important thing to know right at the top is that there's this massive paradox happening right now.
Right.
Cable news has been telling you that things in the Gulf are de-escalating because of a June ceasefire. But the marine insurance market, which prices risk faster than any diplomat can issue a statement, is telling a totally different, much scarier story.
Yeah, the marine insurance market, it just doesn't care about political spin or, hopeful press releases. It only cares about the ground truth.
Right. And what is that ground truth right now?
Well, the ground truth in the Gulf is that the June ceasefire is entirely dead. Over the past week, the U.S. has bombed Iranian military targets for 9 consecutive nights.
9 nights in a row?
Exactly. They've been hitting coastal surveillance, command centers, missile sites, basically trying to force the strait open.
And Iran's reaction?
In response, Iran has officially declared that mid-June 60-day ceasefire, that memorandum of understanding, to be just totally null and void, and they are actively firing on commercial tankers again.
Which brings us to the financial reality, right? The cable news anchors are saying diplomats have it under control, but the cost to ensure a tanker transit has just, absolutely exploded. What are the actual numbers looking like?
It's a complete shock to the system. So normally, a ship owner buys war risk insurance for a single transit through a dangerous area, right?
Oh, yeah?
And that premium usually sits at about 0.25% of the ship's total hull value. But right now, underwriters are demanding anywhere between 3% and 10%.
Wow. Wait, so to put real dollars to that percentage, what are we talking about?
Well, a transit that cost a shipping company $250,000 back in February, 5 months ago, it now costs up to $10 million.
10 million?
$10 million. For the exact same ship carrying the exact same cargo along the exact same route.
Okay, let's unpack this because those numbers are just staggering.
Yeah.
Imagine your daily car insurance suddenly jumping from $1,000 a year to $40,000 overnight.
Right.
You wouldn't just promise to drive more carefully. You would stop driving entirely. You'd leave the car in the garage. But a global energy company can't just leave a supertanker in the garage, can they?
Well, they can't. But the thing is, the insurance companies hold the ultimate veto power here. Legally and commercially, a massive oil tanker just cannot dock at a major port without liability and hull insurance.
So if you lose your coverage?
You breach your commercial contracts. Period. So if a syndicate of underwriters in London or New York decides the risk of a missile strike is just too high and they refuse to issue that $10 million policy, the ship simply does not sail.
So the financial sector is effectively enforcing a blockade that the militaries are trying to break.
Exactly.
And it really comes down to geography, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Because you can't just steer around the problem. I was looking at the maps in our source stack, and this channel is incredibly narrow.
Yeah, it is a profound global choke point. The Strait of Hormuz is only about 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point.
Which is tiny.
It's tiny. And because the waters are shallow in certain areas, supertankers have to navigate through these designated traffic lanes that are only 2 miles wide in each direction.
2 miles. Yeah. For ships that are, a quarter mile long and carrying millions of gallons of crude?
Yep.
That leaves literally no room for error.
None at all. And under normal circumstances, roughly 20 million barrels of crude oil and petroleum products are squeezed through that tiny 2-mile gap every single day.
20 million barrels?
Yes, that represents 20% of total world oil consumption. And by some metrics, it's up to 1/3 of all the seaborne oil trade globally.
So we have this tiny unavoidable bottleneck, and suddenly it's an active war zone. I want to understand how we actually got to this point in 2026. Because, in the spring, the media was treating this like a crisis averted.
Right, so the initial trigger was back on February 28th. The U.S. and Israel launched a coordinated military campaign called Operation Epic Fury against Iran.
And that opened with the killing of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, right?
Exactly, and that ignited just months of intense, chaotic missile and drone exchanges across the Gulf.
But Epic Fury supposedly wrapped up in May. That's why everyone thought the worst was over.
The formal end of the operation was declared on May 5th, yeah. But the surface-level peace was a complete mirage.
How so?
The formal military campaigns paused, but the asymmetric attacks on commercial tankers, they didn't stop at all. Diplomats scrambled and managed to get a fragile 60-day memorandum of understanding signed on June 17th.
So like a 60-day window to figure out a permanent fix.
Right. But as we saw, by mid-July, that window shattered completely.
And the human toll here is just devastating. I mean, the data shows 17 U.S. service members have been killed since the escalation in February.
It's tragic.
And on the commercial side, Iran struck 2 UAE-operated supertankers, the Mombasa and the Al-Bahaya, using cruise missiles while they were right inside the strait. 1 sailor was killed in those strikes, and 8 more were severely injured.
Yeah, and because of those strikes, the waters are now considered so incredibly dangerous that there are roughly 6,000 commercial seafarers currently stranded in the region on their vessels.
6,000 people just stuck.
Just stuck. The International Maritime Organization is desperately trying to establish safe maritime corridors just to evacuate these civilian crews.
So I'm trying to visualize the economic impact of this. If ships aren't moving because they can't get insurance or because they're literal sitting ducks, what happens to the oil supply? Does the market just panic instantly?
Oh, the market panics and the physical flow drops off a cliff. In the first quarter of 2026 alone, the flow of crude through the strait fell by nearly 30% compared to the previous year.
Wow.
That's a direct loss of about 6 million barrels a day.
6 million barrels a day.
Yeah.
Just gone from the global market.
Gone. I mean, once the direct threats to the ships began and the insurance premiums spiked, over 95% of the shipping traffic simply diverted.
95%.
Yeah. What's fascinating here is how the physical geography of this 33-kilometer channel makes avoidance almost physically impossible for global energy supply chains.
But wait, I'm looking at this from an infrastructure perspective. We're talking about Saudi Arabia and the UAE, some of the wealthiest nations on Earth.
Sure.
If we're losing 6 million barrels a day through the water, why can't they just pipe the oil overland to the Red Sea and completely bypass Hormuz? Don't they have backup pipelines for this exact nightmare scenario?
They absolutely do. And for a short time, those overland pipelines, like the East-West pipeline in Saudi Arabia, they were acting as the ultimate relief valve. The oil was moving over the land, avoiding the strait entirely.
Okay, so problem solved, right?
Well, no, because on July 20th, a massive new variable entered the equation. Houthi forces in Yemen officially declared a maritime embargo against Saudi Arabia.
Hold on, I need you to explain the mechanics of that. A pipeline is buried underground on land. How does a maritime group operating out of Yemen block an overland pipe?
It's a great question because you're right. The pipeline itself is perfectly safe. But think about where that pipe leads. It carries the oil across the desert and dumps it into massive storage terminals right on the coast of the Red Sea.
Oh, right.
The oil still needs to get onto a ship to reach Europe or Asia.
Okay, I see where this is going. It's like finding a detour around a massive highway pileup, only to realize the sinkhole just swallowed the detour bridge.
Exactly. If the Houthis embargo the waters around that terminal and they fill the Red Sea with attack drones, no commercial tanker is going to pull up to load the oil. The physical pipe is intact, but it becomes a bridge to nowhere.
Wow.
The geographic isolation of the Middle East means whether you go through the Persian Gulf or the Red Sea, you eventually have to put your cargo on a ship and pass through waters that are currently highly contested.
So if 95% of traffic is diverting now, what happened the last time this region was a war zone? Because I'm looking at our notes on the tanker war from the 1980s, during the Iran-Iraq conflict, and it seems like the disruption back then was vastly different.
Yeah, the 1980s were brutal. From 1984 to 1988, the Gulf was essentially a free fire zone. Iraq conducted 283 strikes on commercial vessels. Iran conducted 168.
That is a staggering number of attacks.
It really is. By the end of 1987, 116 merchant sailors had been killed. The U.S. Navy even had to step in with Operation Earnest Will.
Right, that was one where they reflagged Kuwaiti tankers as American vessels and provided military escorts.
Exactly. It was the largest naval convoy operation since World War II, and it led to the tragic deaths of 37 American sailors when the USS Stark was hit by 2 Iraqi missiles.
So what does this all mean? We had hundreds of attacks in the 80s, and the data shows that during all of that violence, the strait never closed, and only about 2% of shipping traffic was ever disrupted. The ships just kept sailing.
Yep.
But today, traffic nearly stops overnight. We are seeing 95% diversion. Is this just because modern insurance companies are more risk-averse, or are 2026 cruise missiles just that much more devastating to a supertanker?
It's definitely a mix, but it fundamentally comes down to the evolution of military technology and how the financial sector models risk.
Okay.
In the 1980s, the militaries were relying heavily on, unguided munitions, rudimentary sea mines, older aircraft. And a supertanker is essentially a giant floating piece of thick steel.
Right.
It takes an incredible amount of kinetic force to sink one. A dumb bomb might hit the deck, cause a fire, damage some cargo, but the ship usually survives.
But today, we aren't dealing with unguided munitions.
Not at all. Today you're dealing with highly advanced, precision-guided anti-ship cruise missiles and AI-coordinated drone swarms.
Which changes the math entirely.
Exactly. It's the difference between trying to sink a floating warehouse with a blindfolded shotgun blast versus a drone that is specifically programmed to fly straight into the ship's engine room or detonate directly against the bridge where the crew is.
The probability of a total catastrophic loss is just so much higher.
Precisely. And the insurance actuaries, the mathematicians who calculate these risks in London and New York, they know this. Back in the 80s, the actuarial tables allowed underwriters to accept a certain baseline of risk to keep the oil flowing.
And today?
Today, the math is black and white. If the data says a $100 million vessel carrying $150 million of cargo has a 40% probability of taking a precision missile strike to its engineering bay, the underwriter simply will not issue the policy.
Okay, so if the physical oil stops moving, how is Wall Street processing this? Because when I look at the intelligence briefs from the major banks, they don't even seem to be looking at the same planet, let alone the same data set.
The divergence in the economic forecasting right now is fascinating. It really shows how hard it is to price geopolitical chaos.
Let's start with Goldman Sachs.
Right, so Goldman Sachs, for a while they were showing incredible, almost premature optimism. When that June ceasefire was holding, Goldman actually cut their odds of a U.S. recession from 30% down to 15%.
They really thought it was over.
They did. They were forecasting global oil prices to settle peacefully around $80 a barrel.
Why did they get it so wrong? Were they just looking at the diplomatic press releases while the insurance guys were looking at satellite imagery of missile launchers?
That's a huge part of it. Goldman was pricing in a durable peace based on political statements. But as we know, Brent crude, which is the global benchmark price for oil, is already sitting at $89.22 today following those 9 nights of renewed strikes. They just completely misjudged the fragility of the ceasefire.
And on the flip side, you have J.P. Morgan and EY Parthenon telling a much darker story.
Much darker. J.P. Morgan has kept their U.S. recession odds stubbornly high, right around 35%, and EY Parthenon is the most bearish of the group, putting the recession probability at 40%.
Wait, and EY Parthenon's model isn't just focused on crude oil, is it? They're looking at the cascading effects across the whole supply chain.
Exactly. Their model is crucial because it highlights that crude oil is essentially just dirty liquid. To be useful, it has to be baked into gasoline, diesel, and plastics at a refinery.
Right.
So EY Parthenon is warning that if the raw crude, what the industry calls feedstock, doesn't reach the downstream refineries, the entire consumer economy stalls.
Which makes sense.
And furthermore, you have to factor in liquefied natural gas, or LNG, which also relies heavily on the Strait of Hormuz. When the transit route is blocked, the disruption multiplies at every single step of the global supply chain.
Okay, but then sitting completely on the other side of the room, you have BNP Paribas. They are putting out this dissenting theory that the United States is actually fairly insulated from all of this chaos.
Yes, and their argument rests on a major shift in global energy dynamics. The U.S. is currently the world's largest crude producer and a net energy exporter.
Right.
So BNP's theory is that when global oil prices spike, the extra money being paid for that oil is largely flowing right back into American energy companies in places like Texas and North Dakota.
So they're saying it just moves the money around inside the country.
basically. The high prices redistribute wealth domestically rather than draining the U.S. economy to pay foreign producers.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because I have a really hard time buying BMP's logic there.
Yeah.
I mean, sure, on paper, we produce our own oil, but we don't exist in a vacuum.
Right.
And again, we're just presenting these economic theories impartially here, not endorsing one or the other. But if a sustained closure of Hormuz sends oil to $150 a barrel in Europe, our biggest trading partners are going to go into a massive recession.
Yep.
If Europe is bankrupt and stops buying American exports, how insulated can the U.S. economy realistically be? We can't just put up a wall and pretend we aren't part of a globally connected market.
You've just hit on the exact warning issued by the International Monetary Fund.
Oh, really?
Yeah. The IMF isn't looking at this as an isolated American or European problem. They're looking at the entire board. Their April assessment was stark. They said a sustained closure of the Strait of Hormuz would bring the global economy close to a severe recession.
And just to clarify the technical definition there, the IMF defines a global recession as annual global GDP growth dropping below 2%, correct?
Correct. And to give you some historical context on how bad that is, the world has only crossed that sub-2% threshold 4 times since 1980.
Wow, only 4 times.
That's how rare and severe a global recession actually is. It means systemic, widespread economic contraction, massive job losses, and just a dramatic drop in global trade.
Okay, so we have the battlefield reality of the drones and the missiles, and we have the macroeconomic models from Wall Street. Let's bring this down to the micro level.
Let's do it.
What actually happens next, and how does this directly affect you, the person listening to this right now? According to our sources, there are 3 very distinct, grounded possibilities for the rest of 2026.
Let's start with the most likely scenario, based on the patterns we've seen since the initial strikes in February. This is basically a cycle of flare-ups and lulls.
Okay, so what does that look like?
You see a few weeks of heavy military strikes, followed by a pause, some quiet back-channel diplomacy, and then the strikes eventually resume. It's just the status quo of chaos.
And what did that do to the market?
In this scenario, oil prices stay elevated, bouncing around in the $80 to $95 a barrel band. But the crucial part is that those astronomical marine insurance costs stay baked into the system.
Because the risk is still there.
Exactly. Because as we said, an underwriter isn't going to drop a premium from $10 million down to $250,000 just because nobody fired a missile on a Tuesday. The risk of the war restarting is permanently factored in.
What about a more optimistic outcome? What's the best case scenario here?
The negotiated stabilization. This relies on international mediators finding a way to revive something resembling that June Memorandum of Understanding. If they can enforce a real, durable pause in hostilities, oil could settle back down. The World Bank's baseline projection for 2026 is around $86 a barrel if things stabilize and the shipping lanes slowly reopen.
But then there's the worst case scenario, the sustained disruption.
Yeah, this is the scenario that keeps economists awake at night. If the Houthi embargo in the Red Sea holds and the Strait of Hormuz remains simply too dangerous for transit over a long period, the numbers get terrifying.
How terrifying.
Well, the World Bank predicts oil could average $115 a barrel. But Allianz research goes even further.
Yeah, let's talk about their downside model, because it is incredibly bleak.
They model a scenario where the strait is effectively closed for over 3 months. In finance, this is what's known as a tail risk, an event that is highly unlikely but would cause catastrophic damage if it happened.
Right.
But Allianz is warning that this tail risk is rapidly becoming a base case possibility. In that event, they project oil temporarily spiking to an agonizing $180 a barrel.
$180 a barrel. That's
Yep.
almost double what it is now.
Yes. That kind of price shock would immediately trigger a severe Eurozone recession, and it would validate EY Parthenon's 40% U.S. recession probability. It would break the supply chain entirely.
And this is where we really have to translate all of these billions of dollars and abstract economic theories into real life. Because you might think a conflict over a 33-kilometer channel halfway across the world has absolutely nothing to do with you.
Right. It feels far away.
But it is fundamentally woven into your daily life. It's the price you pay at the gas pump when you commute to work. It's the hidden delivery fee suddenly attached to an online order because the cargo ship carrying your package had to reroute thousands of extra miles around the entire continent of Africa to avoid the Gulf.
Exactly. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it goes beyond the direct costs. It profoundly impacts interest rates. Central banks watch energy-driven inflation like hawks. If energy prices spike, everything costs more to manufacture, package, and transport. That drives up core inflation across the board.
Right. And if inflation stays high, the central bank, whether that's the Federal Reserve in the U.S. or the European Central Bank, they absolutely refuse to cut interest rates.
Precisely. So that home mortgage you were hoping to refinance, or that auto loan you need for a new car, the interest rates stay punishingly high, squeezing your personal budget, all because 6 million barrels of oil a day couldn't make it through a narrow strip of water in the Middle East.
It is wild to think about the sheer interconnectedness of it all. We started this deep dive looking at 9 nights of military strikes and a fragile ceasefire that completely fell apart in real time.
Yeah.
We looked at how a standard $250,000 insurance policy mutated into a $10 million ransom on global shipping. And we traced those shockwaves from the Houthi embargoes in the Red Sea, straight through the Wall Street models, all the way to the inflation hitting your grocery bill and your mortgage rate.
It really emphasizes how fragile the global system is. I mean, we often assume that the flow of global commerce is this unstoppable force, but it relies entirely on a few critical geographical choke points and a complex web of financial trust. When either of those breaks down, the ripples spare no one.
This raises an important question, though, doesn't it?
It does. It brings up a final thought I want to leave you with as you go about your day. We always look at the physical military assets, the fighter jets, the cruise missiles, the drone swarms.
Right.
And we naturally assume that absolute power lies with the people pulling the triggers. We think the militaries control the outcome, but do they?
It's a great question.
Because if a 33-kilometer choke point can completely paralyze global supply chains, who actually controls the global economy? Is it the governments firing the missiles? Or is it a handful of private marine insurance underwriters sitting quietly in air-conditioned offices in London and New York, crunching actuarial tables?
Because right now, they essentially hold the absolute veto power to decide whether a ship is allowed to sail at all. If the underwriter says no, the world stops driving. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive, and as always, keep questioning the headlines.